hello, and welcome to our Power Rankings episode 2 of the year. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I'm joined by Joe Meade. This is episode 49 of In a Nutshell, and it is coming out on October the 3rd, 2024. Joe, we did Power Rankings before the season. Now we're doing them again with what we have learned. So, the viewers can see it. They can see us up in the top left. They can see our power rankings on the right. As we go through the teams, we will kind of go over what they've done this year and where we have them. You see the rankings. You see the columns 1 through 18. We're going to fill those in as the night goes. So, Joe, alphabetical order means that we are going to start with the Illinois Fighting Illini. They are 4-1 on the year, 1-1 in the Big Ten, which included an impressive victory on the road in Lincoln against Dylan Raiola and the Nebraska Cornhuskers. At the time, impressive home victory against a ranked Kansas team the season hasn't gone great for them, so that's not as impressive now. And then their loss is a tough one on the road in a very, very tough environment in Happy Valley. So, Joe, anything to add to Illinois season?
No, I think Luke Altmaier's been really impressive. If you've listened to us weekly, he's been a consistent guy that's gone from someone who couldn't even be a game manager at times last year to being one toward the end of last year to starting to become one, and now he's starting to become a borderline playmaker at times, Sean. Look at the Nebraska game. You would have thought this guy's not maybe an NFL prospect, but a guy who was highly sought after, and that's what he was in the transfer portal when he came over from Ole Miss. I do think Caden Fegan's been impressive. I think Pat Bryant is one of the premier receivers and playmakers in this conference, a guy not a lot of people knew until September 2024. With all that said, Sean, do you want me to give the ranking?
Yeah, go ahead. I do think
Yeah.
Altmaier's been impressive. Bielema's definitely been impressive. We knew he was a good coach, but he certainly. I had them near the bottom, and I was pretty wrong about them, and you'll see where I have them in just a second after Joe goes. All right, Joe, where are the Fighting Illini?
Illinois, had they beaten Penn State, they would have easily been top three since they did not, and I thought their offense could have played a lot better, but they didn't completely disappoint me. I'm going to give the Fighting Illini, I think they're the sixth best team in this conference right now.
All right, so the viewers, hopefully they can see. Yes, they can. All right, so Illinois is there in the 6th spot for Joe, and Joe, I don't disagree that much. I have them just one slot higher in the 5th spot. I think they're going to be a ranked team for most of the season. I think they provided a decent account of themselves on the road at Penn State. It's just spoiler alert for later, but I do think they played probably one of the 2 or 3 teams that they would have lost to with that performance. But that is Illinois in the 5th for me, and in the 6th for Joe. All right, Joe, Team 2, the Indiana Hoosiers. Definitely the biggest surprise of the conference so far. Kurt Signetti comes over from James Madison, and at the press conference, when asked, how can you sell recruits, he goes, I just win, look me up. And that has become the case more so in this year. The Hoosiers got off to a really nice start. They are 5-0. They are 2-0 in the Big Ten, including a 29-point victory on the road at UCLA and a 14-point victory against Maryland at home. Joe, the Hoosiers are ranked at the taping of this episode. Anything to add on the Hoosiers before we slide them in there?
No, Sean, not too much to add. I think the amount of playmakers they've had on this team, Curtis Rourke, Elijah Surratt, who really came onto the scene Saturday against Maryland. This is a team in Indiana. Normally it was a team that could beat you in only like one way, which is through the air raid with Kevin Wilson, Tom Allen. It was like the team camaraderie, but that wasn't sustainable, clearly, after the COVID season. And let's face it, Michael Penix probably had a lot to do with that. All that said, Sean, I want to give Indiana the 8th spot for now. I think that could really change. This is just based off September. I think 5-0 is really good. They're clearly the most improved program in the conference so far. But until they beat someone, I don't think any of their one-by-one results are that shocking, including even the UCLA game. So give me Indiana at 8, and that's also said as a compliment, too, because I'm expecting them to do this.
Yeah, Joe, I'm not a whole lot different, just a little bit more optimistic. I've got him one slot ahead in the seventh spot. I think Curtis Rourke is a lot better than people thought. He was a MAC player of the year at Ohio, but and he is a fifth year player, and I think people expected him to be certainly solid, but he is up there near the top of the quarterback totem pole in this conference too. That episode will be at a later date. We'll power rank the quarterbacks, but as of now, Joe, I think Curtis Rourke has to be in the top three for sure. He is moving the ball around nicely. He does have a lot of targets, and Indiana is, just one win away from bowl eligibility, which their total in Vegas at the beginning of the year, if you remember, was 5.5. So, barring a total catastrophe, they will hit that over, and Kurt Signetti will have a successful first season in Bloomington. All right, Joe, up next is a team that has been a topic of a number of our conversations here, and that is the Iowa Hawkeyes. Kurt Ferentz is back after a Big Ten championship appearance and an unsuccessful season last year at the same time. The offense was really bad coming in, but so far they've done all right on that front. They are 3-1 at the taping of this episode. They did lose a really tough one at home to Iowa State in the Cy-Hawk game, in a game which they did control, but still they've taken care of business. In their other games, they have a nice road victory against Minnesota as their only Big Ten win. At 3-1, Joe, where do you have Iowa?
I have Iowa at the 9, so call them the middle class. Okay. I think that might shock a lot of people.
Actually,
but
it's not that shocking. Never mind. I have.
Oh, no. I do think the addition of a really good running game, and not that Caleb Johnson wasn't there, but this guy's a different animal than he was last year. Caleb Johnson, I do think if Cade can become the game manager he was in 2021, they could be in even better shape because that Phil Parker defense is always going to bring it. If they could incorporate Luke Lachey even more, I think this team could be pretty dangerous. This is for September. This is prior to them playing Ohio State. Should they really show up in that game, they could really skyrocket up this. But for now, Iowa's going to be the 9, the middle ground of the conference.
And Caleb Johnson, for me, is the difference maker. He is second or third best running back in the country at this point, and for a team that has been screaming out for just even an average offense for years now, to have a superstar in a at this time looks like a future NFL running back, that's big for the Hawkeyes. Their defense is there. They're going to win a lot of games. They do have a tough one in just a few days at Ohio State, but after that the schedule does get a little easier, and there's an opportunity for a 9 or 10 win season. So, Joe, not a whole lot different. Once again, I have them just one spot above in the 8th spot. So you could see we both agree of the 3 teams that start with an I. It's Illinois, Indiana, and then Iowa. Just a little bit different in the grand scheme of things. All right, Joe, up next, the Maryland Terrapins. Another team that's had a really odd start to the season with a pretty difficult schedule, I would say. Overall, they do play. They did lose at home to Michigan State in week 2. A tough one there. They did beat UConn. They did beat Virginia on the road. They did beat an FCS Villanova team. And then they did lose on the road at Indiana in a game that probably, from their point of view, was there for the taking. But underachieved so far for Maryland, while they are showing signs of still being at least an average football team.
Yeah, I think Maryland, it's really unfortunate because I think Billy Edwards Jr. would be getting a lot of spotlight if Maryland was Indiana, and by that I mean 5-0. Roman Hemby, we knew he's been a constant the last 3 years in this conference. He's a phenomenal running back. Ty Felton's done great. I think he's 642 reception yards through 5 games, Sean. That's ridiculous. But that's the problem, Sean. It's a Mike Loxley team. That kind of production's normal. It was for Talia. And, Sean, the defense is a huge problem. I am still mystified that Loxley was boasting about it at media day. Now, maybe the season's certainly not over in September, I'll tell you that. But what I've seen so far is disgraceful. Michigan State torched them. Indiana torched them. Those 2 offenses are really improved, particularly Indiana and Michigan State. But that defense cannot stop anyone to save that team's life. And with that said, Sean, that's why I have Maryland at 14. I do think of the teams I'm going to rank from like 14 to 18, they have the highest ceiling. But for now, just at 14. Simple as that, the defense.
I've got them in the same exact spot, Joe. Certainly down on them compared to where we were at the beginning of the season. The home game against Michigan State, they were significant favorites in, and the uncertainty of Michigan State is probably, I mean, there might not be a team in the country that has as much uncertainty as Michigan State, higher highs, lower lows, but that was disappointing, and they really have been unable to stop anyone on offense, even giving up 20 points to an FCS team in Villanova. I mean, you had to expect it a little better. Obviously, the season is not over for them yet. They still have a number of opportunities for victories in this Big Ten, but I've got them 14th as well. A little disappointing so far for the Terps. All right, Joe. Aforementioned Michigan State, the Spartans have new coach Jonathan Smith coming in. They are 3-2 and 1-1 in the Big Ten. Opening day was a little tough for them. They just squeaked by FAU. They did pick up that nice road win at the Terps. They beat Prairie View 40-0. They had a really, really close call against Boston College on the road where a couple of costly turnovers may have cost them in the end, and a tough one at home to Ohio State just a couple days ago. The quarterback situation is one thing. Aiden Childs certainly has a lot of room to grow, but the other players might be a little better than we thought, and that's credit to Jonathan Smith and the coaching staff there for putting together a team almost exclusively through the transfer portal. So, Joe, thoughts on Michigan State and where you have them?
I'm really impressed not only with Smith, but Joe Rossi, the defensive coordinator from Minnesota that is now the Michigan State defensive coordinator. I think with the limited talent he has, especially after losing Dylan Tatum week 1, that defense has stood up. I know we just saw the Ohio State game, but if you listen to this when we release it probably on Friday or Thursday, you're going to be pretty mystified that I'm crediting their defense. But their front seven's held up really well. And that's without even mentioning, Jerron Glover, Nick Marsh, Montori Foster, Jack Valley, who we knew was a pro. He's an NFL tight end, Sean, who they got from Oregon State. They haven't really had to involve Antonio Gates Jr. yet. I certainly think that rushing-wise, Nate Carter's a solid running back. I think K'Ron Lynch-Adams is more your big play guy. I understand at this stage he has more yardage and he averages more per carry than Carter. But they have some pieces there. It's really too bad the offensive line is a little banged up right now. I do think if you could, and I'll try to make this as clear as possible, if you could have the 2025 Michigan State offensive line with this offense, they'd be a lot more lethal. I think Jordan Turner, Angelo Gross, Ed Woods, Chris Bogle, I think those are the real standouts on defense. Chris Bogle, by the way, another sixth-year guy, so Michigan State certainly taking advantage of that. All that said, it's a credit to Smith putting this roster together really on the fly, not necessarily last minute, but not with the amount of resources you've seen like an Ole Miss have or even a Texas A&M have, Sean. So good job by Smith. Where I have Michigan State, Sean, I got the Spartans at number 12. I think, like Maryland, they could really skyrocket up these rankings with a good October. There's certainly not a lack of opportunity with Oregon, Iowa, and Michigan on their schedule before we rank these teams again. But for now, bottom line is turnovers got to stop, and they got to stop leaving the defense out there too long. And I still think they're at a talent disadvantage as they go into these next 3 games, with Ohio State being the first one. So Michigan State, number 12.
Yeah, all the problems that have been identified for them, Joe, they are 3-2 with 2 losses to top 25 teams at this point, and one of which they had a chance to win it. So I do think the ugly will be really ugly for Michigan State this year. They probably will lose a game that they shouldn't, but also they are capable of beating almost anyone with their sheer explosiveness of some of their offensive players. They get a couple of their injured players back, and they might be able to cause some noise. I've got them in 13th, pretty similar to you. I think they'll probably lose more games than they win in terms of Big Ten, and maybe they can just squeak enough for bowl eligibility. But at this point, You really don't know what you're going to get when you see the Spartans take the field, and that can't really be said to any other team in this conference, at least to that extent. So Spartans, I got 13th. You've got them 12th. Up next, Joe. Drop the state. It's just Michigan. The Wolverines, the defending national champions. High in our rankings. Obviously, a number of changes from last year, including all the way up at the top. Sharon Moore takes over. The quarterback situation was expected to be a little bit of a drop off from J.J. McCarthy, but not this much. Davis Warren starts the year. Extreme ineffectiveness leads Alex Orji into that role now, and his throwing is certainly limited. Now, they are 4-1 at the time of recording, which is probably the record that we think they would have been at this point. They are 2-0 in the Big Ten. But, Joe, the loss was to Texas. It was at home. It wasn't pretty. The Longhorns, who are probably the best team in the country, win that one 31-12. And Michigan barely gets over the line against a really good USC team. But, Joe, compared to preseason expectations, they have to be a little bit down on Michigan.
Yeah, and again, it's really, I mean, we could talk about this every week. It's the lack of any passing offense. It's a huge issue. Outside of Colston Loveland, they are not confident throwing to anyone else unless it's like a clear dump down or like a screen to Donovan Edwards. Because jet sweeps don't count as passes in my book, even if they want to record one or two as that. It's not. Fantasy football might deceive you. It certainly won't deceive me. With that said, Shad, the Michigan defense, I think Wink Martindale, since the Texas game, has done a really good job adjusting. Now, the second half of the last two games have not been pretty, but I also argue that the special teams and the offense put them in terrible positions, leaving them out there that long. This is a unit that has also been banged up. Will Johnson's not fully healthy. Josiah Stewart was out against Minnesota. It's pretty evident that Macy Graham and Kenneth Grant are not 100% either. They've been gassed at the end of games too. Uh, Sean, in spite of all these problems, one thing Michigan's done really well, they just make the plays well. And that's as simple as that. And what I mean by that is they don't do anything incredibly stupid, which is something a lot of these teams in this conference have done. They didn't throw a pick six. That was USC. They threw the pick six against Michigan. They've been opportunistic when they've had to be. And when they've played good, they've really taken advantage of it because when they've played bad, it hasn't quite accosted them since the first half and particularly the last two games have been so good. With that said, Sean, I have the defending Big Ten and national champions at number 4. I do think that their floor is limited to being like 9 in our next ranking, but their ceiling could be as high as number 2, considering the challenging October they have. You got Washington bye week, at Illinois, and then Michigan State. Those are all games that present unique challenges to Michigan. I think if they win all 3 of those games, you could see the Wolverines as high as number 2 in our next power rankings when we do this next month.
And Joe, I agree with most of what you said. They are a little bit. They don't have the ability to, so far, to finish off games that they are in total control in, and I could see them losing to just about anybody in the top half of the conference, and that will not be the case in the teams above them. They do have a number of big games next week, and they're a team that could change a lot of spots week 8 or 9 when we get around to this next time. But, Joe, I've got them in 6th. I just think while they are capable of beating anybody, I do think anybody is capable of beating them. And really one loss to a non-ranked team, whether it's Oregon or Ohio State or even Illinois, might derail their season. And just, the college football playoff is still a possibility, but at the same time, they are one loss away from it being not a possibility. So I've got them 6th. They still don't have a Big Ten loss. They're still in good shape, but in terms of the future, I do think they might get picked off by somebody that shouldn't do it. So I've got Michigan 6th. You have got them 4th. Up next, as we go down to the list, to the team that they just beat. PJ Fleck's Minnesota Golden Gophers are 2-3 on the year. A record that might be a little bit harsh on how they've played, but at the same time, they have not got the job done in crunch time. North Carolina does win 19-17 over the Gophers in week 1, but they bounce back with shutouts against Rhode Island and Nevada. They do stub their toe in the second half against Iowa. They were leading 14-7 at home. They end up getting blanked and losing that one 31-14. And then last week they do lose to Michigan 27-24. 2-3 for Minnesota. Joe, definitely not what they wanted to start off this season.
No, and I expected Minnesota to be a middle class program in this ranking by now. I thought they would have won the North Carolina game. Certainly should have. I thought they would have. I really thought they would beat Iowa too. With that said, Sean, it's as simple as this. I don't think their playmakers have been in enough positions on offense, particularly a Darius Taylor, a Marcus Major. I think Max Brosmer has been a little disappointing. I think he's done some really good things, but for example, the fumble in the UNC game, throwing the pick against Michigan, and then being like ineffective for like four straight drives. That can't happen, especially when you have as limited an output uh, on the offensive side as Minnesota does. I think their defense has been solid, but the solid being solid when your offense has been inept at times isn't going to win you a lot of games. Where let's face it, Sean, the Iowa, UNC, and Michigan game, there's a talent deficiency. So with that said, Sean, Minnesota 15th. I think they're gonna have to do a lot to get out of like this bottom, not even bottom half, like the real bottom of the conference. I do think between the teams we're gonna rank 16th to 18th that they are a lot better than those teams. But for now, they're the bottom. They're the like tip of the lower class, I'll say.
Yeah, I have them in 12th, Joe, and there is not much that separates. I will say Minnesota in 12th and 18th. I think there's a distinct bottom six, and you could even delve that into a bottom three and then a second to bottom three. But yeah, they've just played a little bit better than their results at this point, and I do think they are better than Michigan State in terms of consistency. And now they don't do a lot of things well, but they don't do anything terrible. So that's why I have them there. I just think they might win a couple more football games because of that. Now, we are kind of splitting straws here because there are so many teams, but definitely not what they wanted so far, but it's very close to being a pretty good start for Minnesota. All right, up next, Nebraska. Dylan Raiola, true freshman, has come in with all of the hype, and for the most part, he has delivered. They do have just one loss on the year. They are 4-1, and 1-1, that was a home loss to Illinois in overtime. They get past UTEP, Deion Sanders' Colorado Buffaloes, and Northern Iowa with relative ease before that Illinois loss. And then despite a 0-0 halftime score last week against Purdue and West Lafayette, they do end up winning that one 28-10. So thoughts on Dylan Raiola and the Nebraska Cornhuskers so far?
I don't want to highlight his mistakes over what he's done well because if you went from their QB situation last year to Dylan Raiola right now, that's as good a improvement as you'll find in this conference, perhaps maybe around the country, considering that the guy's a true freshman. You knock on wood, have him for 2 more years with the insanity that is college football. Shot. Their defense has been solid. The offense has been pretty good. The problem is I don't think they played a team yet outside of Illinois where they've played a complete game. I think even the Purdue game we saw was incomplete. Now, you could tell me the Colorado game was as complete a performance. I would agree. What I would also say, though, is that I think Colorado gave up at halftime, so I don't think the second half of that game is all that meaningful. They do have the ability to do that, though, Sean, and with that said, I have them at 10. I think them and Iowa are the middle class in this conference. I do think that Nebraska advancing up these rankings to closer to the top 5 is going to be difficult. They do play Rutgers in Indiana this month, so I think they could go as high as 7. I just think the fact that Illinois beat them and that it's likely they'll lose at USC, and unless Michigan or Penn State really screws up in October, I do think Nebraska is going to stay in the 7 to 10 range. But they could also fall to like 12 if they lose a dumb game here and there. And by dumb, I mean a game they're not favored in. So I think the Huskers at 10 is a good spot for them right now.
And I agree with most of that. The Illinois game just really sticks out to me. And Illinois is a good team, but Nebraska was at home, and Dylan Raiola did play very well for that entire game until a couple bad plays in overtime. But he seriously outplayed Luke Altmaier from Illinois, and Altmaier didn't do terrible. But when you have that much of an advantage at quarterback, you have to win the football game. Now, there are teams that will find ways around that, but I was just a little bit disappointed in them that they weren't able to win that. And Joe, I've just got them one spot higher in ninth. I agree. I do think, we talked about it multiple times in multiple episodes now. I think they'll be ranked. They were already ranked one time. They'll probably be ranked again. But in terms of consistently punching above their weight, I just don't see it. I do think they lose games. They will lose games to teams that are up near the top, and they'll probably lose road games to teams in and around them as well at this point. And so you've got them 10th. I've got them 9th. Pretty similar opinions there. Up next, Joe, is Northwestern. They were in the news a lot over the last couple of years for reasons that they probably prefer not to. David Braun coming back from his Big Ten Coach of the Year. They have their temporary stadium out there while their real stadium gets construction done. They do win their opener 13-6 over Miami, Ohio, but a tough home loss to Duke the next week leaves them at 2-2 overall and 0-1 in the Big Ten. That one Big Ten loss was a 24-5 loss on the road at newcomers Washington. But Joe, after the surprise of last year, Northwestern, unfortunately, is going to be headed back towards the bottom of the conference.
Yeah, inept offensively. I hope, like the stadium, that this status of Northwestern is temporary because I do like to see them be relatively competitive. I thought the Duke game was a major tipping point, which is unfortunate that early in the season. I think they did a lot of things well in that game. I think Mike Wright played well enough for them to win. Unfortunately, Manny Diaz just had some more horses, and they ended up losing that game. And since then, I think the perception and the confidence kind of swagger of this team went down because I was excited to see them play this year. I think Cam Porter, AJ Henning, Bryce Kurtz are guys that need to get the ball more, and I think they need to be more dynamic in play calling. And frankly, those guys might gotta probably have to step it up a lot, considering the defense is not what it was last year. All this said, Sean, I think Northwestern is the tip of the real bottom class. I have them at 16th, though I will say they're significantly better than the teams in 17th and 18th.
Yeah,
And not too far from, you know, the teams I'm going to have at 13, 14, and 15.
I've got them in the same spot, Joe. That's the first one. But I just think that there's a lot of ways that they can lose a game, especially against other Big Ten teams. They're going to have to play almost perfectly. They did have a chance to beat Duke, but ultimately they didn't get the job done, and chances are they're going to lose a lot of football games this year. Just an inability to string together a drive, let alone an offensive half, let alone a 4 quarters. It's just not really going to happen from the Wildcats there. All right, up next is Ohio State. The Ryan Day is back for another year. They do have a new quarterback after Kyle McCord transfers to Syracuse. They get Will Howard in from Kansas State. And Joe, at the time of recording, they are 4-0 and 1-0 in the Big Ten. They have not really been tested so far, but to their credit, a 52-6 win over Akron, 56-0 over Western Michigan, 49-14 over Marshall, and 38-7 over Michigan State. Ohio State likely going to finish near the top of this conference, and while they do have a number of tough games on the schedule, we haven't seen any of them yet.
No, and Sean, they've thoroughly dismantled everyone, as you pointed out. And what's funny about that is they've showed probably 30% of what their offense can do. Will Howard's ran a little. We all know Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson is probably the best running back duo potential-wise in college football. I don't think it's been on full display quite yet, considering they're sitting out the second halves of most of these games. Jeremiah Smith is awesome. I was skeptical hearing reports that he was already better than Marvin Harrison Jr. I still don't think that's true. I mean, come on. But for a true freshman, the only reason why he's not getting even more attention is because of the guy at Alabama, Ryan Williams. So, that said, Sean, I never questioned the defense of this team. Last year, I was a big fan of it. Ultimately, Ohio State's defense had one poor quarter last year, and it was against Michigan. And outside of that, Sean, I thought I think they probably have a top 3 defense at worst in the country. Right now, it's number 1 statistically scoring wise. I don't look too deep into that. I just know defensively, depth wise, I think one thing I'd like to see is even more pressure on the quarterback in these bigger games, particularly against Oregon this month, and to an extent to dominate a team like Iowa. Because if you dominate a team like Iowa on both sides of the ball, including the defensive side, that's a strong indicator to me that you could match up with Alabama, Texas, Georgia. So, all that said, Sean, the fact they haven't even unleashed their war chest quite yet, Ohio State's got to be number one. And that might not be resume based. It's just on the fact that what they are talent wise. And I'll pose a similar question to everyone. Against Michigan State in that pouring rain at night, would Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, or USC do what Ohio State did to them with a pretty like subpar performance? Will Howard threw a dumb pick. I thought the defense at times was not as dominant as it really could have been, and that's a really dumb critique. But Ohio State's number one. I imagine the furthest they could drop is like to four, should they lose to Oregon. But barring a loss to Iowa as well, Ohio State number one.
Yep, at this point, Joe, I agree. I have them at the top spot. I think they are the conference's best chance at winning a national title. And obviously, this conference won a national title last year, but all of those weapons on offense, Egbuka, Smith, Henderson, Junkins, Howard, they're loaded there and then loaded on defense, as you mentioned earlier, too. So until further notice, they are number one in this conference. All right, up next is the Oregon Ducks, another team, Joe, that will likely be near the top and is already in a number of college football playoff projections. They are 4-0 in the season and 1-0 in the Big Ten, which was a 34-13 win over UCLA. A couple of unimpressive victories early, their victory over Idaho and Boise State coming at much closer margins than they preferred, but since then a 35-point road rivalry game victory against the Beavers of Oregon State and a big win against UCLA. Oregon should be slated for a top fourth of the conference finish.
Yeah, Sean, barring anything colossal. I think Dylan Gabriel, after like a rough two games, and frankly, Sean, I held the Boise State game against them too much in the moment. They're a top 25 team. So ultimately, if Boise State continues to take care of business at the end of the year, when playoff rankings do come out, that's going to be considered a much more of a net positive than a negative that it was in the 2 weeks following. I think you could write those two games off. They were dominant against Oregon State and UCLA. Maybe it's because those teams are depleted of talent. Maybe it's because Oregon knew them. But I ultimately think Oregon's a really good football team. And I think this month for them, like Ohio State, is a true test. And I guarantee you we're probably going to do rankings again before Oregon goes to the big house. So I don't see Oregon falling very far here, Sean. I think barring like a really, really bad loss, and by really bad losses like losing at Purdue on Friday night, that Oregon is going to be within the top, I'll call it the top 16% of this conference, anywhere 1 to 3. All that said, Sean, give me Oregon at number 2. The team we're going to say third is going to be coming up, or that I'm going to say third is coming up. They do have a more impressive resume. I just don't think Oregon showed any true weakness yet, and the team that my number 3 has. So give me Oregon at 2, and Sean, a loaded October, like I said. Michigan State, Ohio State at Purdue, Illinois at home. Those are 2 of those 4 top 25 teams, and teams that are in the top half of this conference. So.
Hey, they do get Ohio State at home and Michigan on the road, Joe. You know, I know a number of things in college football can happen, but they lose those 2 games and they still might be in the college football playoff, depending on how Illinois shake out and how impressive they look in the other ones. But Oregon, to me, I think I'm okay to say week 1 and 2 were rust or just not sharpness, because they've been sharp pretty quickly these last 2 weeks. They're coming off a bye and they're hosting Michigan State. They're going to beat them pretty handily, we think. I've just got them in third. I do think the team up next is just a little bit better so far this year, but at the end of the day, Joe, really top 3, you're splitting hairs, I think, and then at the end, the middle of the pack is the middle of the pack with maybe one team that sprouts out of there and sneaks a 10 seed in the college football playoff or something like that, and then the bottom half of the conference. But Oregon is really good. They do get their first test of a real or against a last year Big Ten team this weekend against Michigan State. So they're third for me, and they're firmly in the college football playoff picture as of now. All right, Joe, up next is Penn State, that other team near the top of the conference. They are 4-0 on the year and 1-0 in the Big Ten. They had an impressive 34-12 road victory against their rivals in West Virginia on opening day. Just a 7-point win to Bowling Green in Week 2, but they bounced back from that with a 56-0 victory against Kent State. And then 2 weeks ago, in a big Saturday night atmosphere game against ranked Illinois, they get the job done 21-7 with some pretty impressive defense. So, Joe, Penn State, good football team this year.
Yeah, Sean, I think they're a really good football team. I do think that the defense did not take much of a step back. I think, talent-wise, they had to have, but, losing a Chop Robinson, the King brothers, and whatnot. But the unit itself is very solid, and at a micro level, you could say that Penn State's not that good a team, but I'm not going to do that. I think this is a really, really good team, and the reason I'm not saying great yet is I have yet to see if they could take the top off of a defense. I know they did against West Virginia. They certainly took advantage of some calls against Illinois doing so. I think outside of Tyler Warren, receiving-wise, they need to do a lot more. I think Harrison Wallace, Omari Evans have shown flashes. I think Julian Fleming needs to step up. I know ever since he's been that big-time recruit, a lot of people have harped on him for not fulfilling that. I think he needs to be used as a weapon. I think Tyler Warren, if he's taken out of a game by a linebacker or a really great defensive scheme, particularly against USC on October the 12th, Penn State could run into some serious problems. And this October schedule, Sean, is very challenging. You got at USC, at Wisconsin, and luckily you have a bye week sandwiched between the USC and Wisconsin game, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say that's going to be a night game in Madison. Now, although Wisconsin, who we're going to talk about later, has its fair share of issues, a night game in Madison is not something a Big Ten football coach looks forward to. They might say that in an interview, but backstage, they're praying that the Big Ten doesn't schedule them for that. So, Penn State, I have them at number 3. The reason they're not at number 2, I'd like to see this offense get a little more dynamic, because if you take away the core of what their offense has been over the last few years, which is their run game and their tight ends, I do not think they have an answer. That's something that's been shown against Michigan and Ohio State the last 2 years. Luckily for them, they don't play Michigan, but that doesn't mean another team like a USC or Wisconsin is not going to figure that out.
All right, Joe, sorry for the mistake here. It looks like our power rankings have frozen for the YouTube. I'm fixing that real quick. But, Joe, I just think they have showed up for their big games so far this year, whether that was West Virginia on the road or Illinois at home. That's why I give them the slight edge over Oregon at this point. But either way, I do think you're kind of splitting hairs whether you want to put Penn State second, Oregon third, or James Franklin's crew. They are on a college football playoff path at this point. Now, things can go wrong. They could lose a game they shouldn't, all that. But at this point, they're a really good team. They're slated for a spot in the top part of the Big Ten Conference, and if they win a couple of these tough games, they might find themselves in Indianapolis at the end of the year for the automatic bid. So Penn State second for me, third for you. Purdue, Joe, tough year for Ryan Walters so far and Hudson Card. Not sure expectations were super high for the Boilermakers coming in, but certainly they have come in lower than them. They're just 1-3 with an opening day victory over Indiana State. They get embarrassed in Week 3 by Notre Dame 66-7. They get embarrassed by Oregon State 38-21. And then despite being tied at halftime at 0-0, they are outclassed by Dylan Raiola and Nebraska in Week 5. So, Joe, Purdue is 1-3. Hudson Card, unfortunately, has shown some serious regression, and Ryan Walters at this point does not look like he has got this Purdue program off the ground in this conference.
No, Sean, and I think, we went from the week of the 14th talking about how that Notre Dame game could be a great opportunity. And what was a great opportunity to show that they were not ready? Oregon State and Nebraska's second half really enforced it. I really thought that if they kept that Nebraska game close, God, even if they won it, because you thought about that in the third quarter at times, this could have really started a second season for Purdue. Unfortunately, this month, at Wisconsin, at Illinois, Oregon at home, and and that'll be it. 3 games this month. I do not see them winning any of those games. Perhaps they could keep Wisconsin competitive because I do not see Illinois nor Oregon being a very fun time for Boilermaker fans. One thing I will say is that your basketball team was just picked today by the Columbus Dispatch to repeat. Uh, I think that's something you should certainly sell your hat on. I'm certainly not throwing shade, but I can't say much positive about this Purdue team right now. I think maybe you could be the spoiler makers again, and in this case, a spoiler maker victory would really derail a team
It'd
because,
be any victory at this point.
yeah,
And
because a 2-10 Purdue, you lose to them, your season's over because I don't see Purdue. It's going to be fascinating between UCLA and Purdue who wins a conference game. With that said, Sean, I'm going to put Purdue at 17th, not quite at the bottom, but you know, certainly getting close to there. And it's a real shame UCLA and Purdue can't play this year.
yep. And Joe, I've got them in last. Pretty evident who I have in 17th and you have in 18th. But just haven't seen much to be excited about for Purdue, and that really shouldn't happen in year two. You can understand if something like this were to happen in year one, and you're putting together a roster which is makeshift and a lot of players here and there that aren't really your style as a coach, but it's been unfortunate for Purdue so far, and unfortunately it is headed for more losses. At this point, any victory would be a real surprise. You can't see them being anywhere close to favored in any game. And being that they do not play UCLA, that seriously decreases their chances for a win. So, Joe, I've got Purdue 18th. You've got them 17th. Up next, the guys from Jersey, Rutgers. They have been a pleasant surprise to start this year. Rutgers fans did make a lot of noise before the year with some pretty high hopes, but so far, Joe, they have met them. They're 4-0 and 1-0 in the Big Ten. They did pick up a nice road victory against a Virginia Tech team that almost nearly beat Miami on the road, and then they beat Washington at home by a field goal. So, Joe, they have made a step up at least into the middle part of this conference, which is really all that we asked them to do this year. They move on from Gavin Wimstadt to Athan Kaliakmanis. Kyle Monungai is a problem at times for the other team when it comes to rushing the football, but Rutgers so far so good for the Scarlet Knights.
Yeah, Sean, and the only thing that you said wrong is he's a problem all of the time. I know
Yeah.
that's what you meant to say.
Well, I
It's been
meant
a long day.
he's a problem for the other team. He's not a problem
Oh,
for
totally.
Rutgers.
1000%.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sean. I look at this October schedule, and I do think there's an inevitable loss, and that's the Friday night stupid 11 p.m. Eastern kickoff at USC. The real shame of that, Sean, is should Rutgers beat Nebraska on October the 5th, I see them going into USC at 7-0. 7-0 Rutgers going to USC, who, by all accounts, could be top 10. At worst, if they lose to Penn State, could be top 15. And that'd be as big a game in Rutgers history, probably since the 2006 Louisville game. That's something I never thought I would say. Now, you do got the hurdles. You do got to beat Nebraska. You haven't had much success with Wisconsin ever. UCLA's a free victory. So, at very worst, Sean, Rutgers is going to be at 5 wins the next time we do this, with a win away from bowl eligibility. But this team is going to shoot higher than that. I do think, like Indiana, being projected to the college football playoff is way too soon. But I do think that there's not a game on the schedule outside of USC that they're not going to have a fighting chance in. So, should things go really well, they could go 11-1. With that said, Sean, Monungai, the defense, solid defensively. Athan Kaliakmanis getting playmakers the ball. I do think he's going to progress even more with Kirk Shiraka. I have Rutgers at 7th. I think they're toward the top third of this conference. And frankly, Sean, I'm not going to be surprised. If they beat Nebraska, barring like a destruction by USC, they could jump Illinois at my 6th spot. And perhaps if Michigan really doesn't get it together, They could be top 5 in this conference come November.
There's a way, Joe, at this point, and I have them 10th, and I have been impressed, but really from 7 through 10 is extremely close. And, being 7-0 would entail a victory over 9 Nebraska, so they'd have to jump over them. And, Joe, there's a way that they can make the Big Ten championship game. They do have that road game against USC. If they can find a way to win that, I mean, other than that, they don't have any road games against teams that are definitely better than them. And the only team that is definitely better than them on their schedule is Illinois at home. And that's a game where you think you have a chance to win. So things are definitely looking up from Rutgers. From what I've seen so far, I have them 10th, but I think there's a repeatable way to winning in this conference with their current style. Now, that has not been the case for Rutgers football in the Big Ten since they joined way back when in 2015, 2014.
14, yeah.
But they've got a serious chance to do some damage this year. They had a nice victory over Washington last week. And, man, if they beat Nebraska, they have a chance to do some real damage this year. All right, Joe, we're wrapping it up with 4 more here. We've already previewed them a little bit by talking about other teams, but UCLA, number of turmoil in that program in the offseason with Chip Kelly leaving the head coaching job to take a coordinator job in the conference. That has certainly never been seen before, unlikely to ever see it again. They did go on the road and beat Hawaii in week 1 by a field goal. And then a bye in week 2. They did get dismantled by Indiana at home, 42-13. They were tied at LSU at halftime the week after, but they did get blanked in the second half there. They ended up losing by 17, and then they did get embarrassed again at home to Oregon. So, Joe, you have UCLA last. The viewers who can see the rankings, I have them 17th. They're not a good football team, and if I had to guess, I do not think they win another game this year.
No, between them and Purdue, if they win one combined game, I'd be very happy for those two programs. I don't say that with shade. It's just I think Chip Kelly really did this program dirty by leaving the way he did in the offseason. I'm not trying to indict Chip's character. It's just the fact of the matter. Couldn't really rebuild in the portal. And frankly, I think the administration there does not care about football, which is a true shame because UCLA, all around athletic-wise, is up there with the Michigan, UNC, Stanford in the Directors' Cup standings every year. And it's a shame that they don't care about football there because there's a lot of potential. And you got to build a bleeping stadium. Come on. You can't play at the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, that was an ugly crowd for the Indiana game, that's for sure. And I know it was a Friday, but still, I mean, that was maybe a quarter full.
Oh, that was, yeah, still ridiculous.
I mean,
yeah.
Maybe it was 25% full. And to be fair, UCLA did get marched down the field by Indiana on their first drive, and then they fumbled the ball and gave up another touchdown almost immediately. So, but separating UCLA and Purdue for me, Joe, is really that I don't think UCLA gets beat by 58 at home by anybody. And that might be as good of a compliment as I can give them. They did have a nice half at LSU, and in terms of putting them ahead of Purdue, that's all I really need to see because the Purdue's been bad, UCLA has been bad, and at this point it's unlikely for both of them to win another football game. So, Joe, we got 3 left. The other team in Los Angeles certainly will finish higher in the conference than their LA counterparts. That is the University of Southern California. They pick up a really nice Week 1 victory against LSU. Miller Moss, the quarterback there, for Coach Lincoln Riley. They did, after that Week 1 victory, have a 48-0 win over Utah State, a tough 27-24 loss at the Big House to Michigan, which honestly could have gone either way, and maybe if the game is 5 minutes longer, they get the job done there. And after a pretty subpar first half last week, they get the job done with a 38-21 victory against Wisconsin. So, Joe, the offense is pretty good despite losing Caleb Williams last year. The defense at times has looked strong, but USC fully deserving of maybe even better than their 11th ranking.
Yeah, Sean, I think this is a top 10 team. It's kind of scary. They're a made tackle against Kaleb Mullings or a non-pick 6 by Will Johnson from being number 2 in these rankings. I'm not kidding. If they beat Michigan and LSU in the month of September, they would be number 2, right behind Ohio State. And I'm not going to lie, Sean, they'd have the best resume in the conference. I don't think there's much of an argument there. I still think they do. I think in terms of playoffs, not to go on any kind of tangent here, Michigan and USC have the best wins in this conference. Ohio State, Oregon have not beaten anyone. Penn State winning at home against Illinois, I think that could age better, but for now, it's nothing too significant. So, with that said, Sean, Miller Moss, I think, has been really good. I think he's a top three QB in this conference thus far. We'll talk about that next week. I think Lincoln Riley's play calling is always a given, even though he was critiqued a little against Michigan, but I do think that's because Michigan's pass rush wreaked havoc on them. Where USC needs to get better is the offensive line and still some of the same problems on defense, even though that unit is so improved with DeAnton Lynn. Uh, that said, Sean, USC is number 5 in my rankings. They have the potential, even after the loss to Michigan, with this month ahead, they're probably playing two top 25 teams in Rutgers and certainly in Penn State on October the 12th. If they beat Penn State, um, one of Oregon and Ohio State's going to lose. If they go through October undefeated, Sean, I'll declare that they might be my number 2 team, and if things really get crazy, they could be my number 1 team
I've been
come October.
I've been really impressed with them. The concerns from last year is, will they meet the physicality of the Big Ten? And while I think that is why they lost to Michigan, the answer to that question is yes. Now I do have USC above Michigan, and I do think they're still a better team than Michigan, and they probably win that game at the Big House 7-8 times out of 10. Now that's not how football goes. It's not a series. It's a one-off. But I've been impressed with them so far, and they are on a path to the college football playoff. Now that will include probably one more big win. But Joe, they do host Notre Dame on the final day. That could essentially serve as a play-in game to the college football playoff. And then they do host Penn State. But Joe, not a single road game that they really should be challenged. Maybe Washington on the road, maybe not. But Joe, I see a lot of W's for USC in the future. And I agree. I think they will be higher next time we do this at the end of the month. So I've got them 4th. You've got them 5th. The final 2 schools here, I think it's pretty obvious where they'll end up. But Washington, newcomers, runners-up from a year ago, they do have a new coach, Jed Fish, coming up from Arizona. They did dismantle Weber State in Eastern Michigan before losing the Apple Cup game against Washington State, 24-19. They did beat Northwestern pretty handily. And then the cross-country trip for a Friday night football game, they did come up short at Rutgers. They lost by 3. They missed 3 field goals. Thoughts on Washington's start so far?
I think they're a good team. I think they're, like many teams in this rankings, there's 1 or 2 plays away from being significantly higher. I like Will Rogers. I think Jed Fish has done a really good job coaching the offense. I think where their issues lie are the trenches. It's such a mismatch when they play a Michigan and even a Rutgers. Like, that can't happen. I think that's going to catch up to them. Maybe they do beat Michigan. We're reporting before that game's played. But I don't think they're going to be able to escape that through October. They got some challenging games. They got Michigan at Iowa. I think between those 2 games, if they win both of those games, Sean, Jed Fish might be my October frontrunner for Coach of the Year along with Kurt Cignetti. At Indiana, like, those are all 3 games that I think they have a path to victory in, but they're not going to be favored to win at least 2 of the 3. They are favored to beat Michigan right now, which I find pretty surprising. But yeah, Sean, Washington, good at protecting the ball, good at playmaking. Jonah Coleman's been great, the guy from the transfer from Arizona who came over with Jed. I think receiving has been pretty serviceable with Giles Jackson, Denzel Boston. So Washington ultimately can be as high as 7 in my rankings had they pulled off the victory against Rutgers, and if they did, they would be 7. Right now they're at 11, slightly below Nebraska, and that's only because I've seen a really good performance out of Nebraska. Yet to see that from Washington against like a good to solid team. So Washington at 11.
Yeah, I just haven't really been thrilled with the lack of consistency this year from Washington. With how many drives they sustained against Rutgers, they really should have come out with more points than just 18. And that can be said for other teams this year, too, whether it was Wazoo or even Northwestern. They managed 24, but they really should have scored more in that one, too. So I do have them in 11th also. I have them at the bottom of the middle of the pack. I think that's the best way we can describe it. I think those teams ranked 7 through 10 through 11 are very interchangeable. They'll probably beat up on each other this year, but at this point, you have to give Rutgers the nod over them because Rutgers won, and Rutgers has looked more complete as a team from minute 1 to minute 60. And I watched some of that Washington State game. Really felt like they should have won that game, and they ended up not. So that's why I got them in 11th. So, Joe, that leaves Wisconsin, the last team here. The 13th spot for you is open. The 15th spot for me is open. And I don't know if the Badgers had really high expectations coming in, but it's been a really lackluster start for the Badgers. 2-2 overall, 0-1. They did beat Western Michigan and South Dakota before losing, albeit a tough game to what many people think is the best team in the country in Alabama at home. They lose their quarterback, Tyler Van Dyke, early in that one to the season. Unfortunately, we will not see him again. And despite putting up a spirited first half effort against USC, they do end up losing that one handily too. So Wisconsin, thoughts on whether they can push themselves into the middle of the pack or whether they'll be dragged down into the bottom?
That's really tough because after the Van Dyke injury, that was the worst part of the Bama game. They could have lost by 70, and they would have preferred to keep Van Dyke. That's without saying.
For sure.
I thought Braden Locke showed a lot against USC in the first half. Unfortunately, the second half just inept. I think there's potential for this team. I think Wisconsin, the fact that it's been such a successful program, people are invested there. I think Luke Fickell is still a really good coach. There's a reason he was the premier acquisition in the 2022 offseason. But their problems are hard to get around. I think Ches Belusi's good, but the defense isn't good. The D-line's certainly not that good. And they don't pressure the quarterback enough. And, losing those guys in the portal is ultimately going to come back to bite them. Now, October, it's more than enough opportunity. Purdue should be a win. At Rutgers, I think could be a really even game if the plays are made. At Northwestern, I know you want to avenge the terrible loss you had to them last year. And then Penn State in a night game. I think if they win 3 of those 4 games, the Badger fan base, I'm not going to say it's going to be that invested, but I think sitting at 5-3 going into November wouldn't be the worst thing for this Wisconsin team. And God forbid they sweep that, we're having a different conversation about Wisconsin. And frankly, Sean, I'm going to say it right now. I would not be shocked if Wisconsin went 3-1 or went really close to being 4-0. Like if they played Penn State really close and lost by 1 score to them in that night game.
Yeah, they're close to being a lot better. I think, we can say, a team could go up 1 spot here and there, but they could easily be in the middle of the pack. And I know the injury of the quarterback, you're not going back in time and erasing that from happening, but you do have Penn State and Oregon, but other than that, Joe, a lot of teams that are going to be in and around you in the conference, and that's really what's going to separate these teams. There's only 9 conference games. You're only playing 8 of the 18 teams. So this is why we're doing these power rankings, because the standings really won't show the whole picture. We'll do it at least 2 more times, maybe even 3, but we want to try and do it before the end of October, maybe in that, I think November 2nd is a Saturday, so we'll try and do a power rankings before then, and then maybe again even at the end of December, and then at the total end of the season after national championship and all that. But I hope this was informative and interesting to the listeners. We updated the power rankings on a Google Sheet with the colors as Joe and I gave out our rankings. We didn't know each other's rankings before, but pretty much a lot of agreeing, Joe. Just 2 teams, 3 different, and a number of teams just 1 or 2 spots different. And just 2 teams in the same spot. Those are the purple teams, Washington and Northwestern. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in to our 2nd edition of Power Rankings. First one in the season. We'd like to do this again, so if this gets a lot of views and interactions and stuff, we'll be sure to do it. All right, see you next time.